Number. The morning was overcast, shrouded in a thick gray mist that rolled up from Lake Trasimeno like steam from some giant's cauldron. I watched as the fog enveloped the hills, filling every valley and depression, dispersing only at the mountain peaks, where the sun barely managed to pierce through. Nothing disturbed the silence, except for the occasional piercing, melancholy cries of birds from the reed-covered shores below. Then suddenly, sounds began to echo across the water. The clash of weapons, the snorting of mules, the neighing of horses, the creaking of wheels, and the harsh shouts of centurions. A Roman army was moving along the road that curved around Lake Trasimeno, and I was leading them. I rode ahead on my white horse, my mind consumed with thoughts of the coming battle. Like all narrow-minded men, I believed the enemy should act according to the laws of strategy and common sense. Since Hannibal crossed the marshes but didn't engage me in battle, instead turning south, I thought, it means he's frightened after learning who commands this Roman army. He prefers to fight Consul Servilius on level ground. This thought filled my heart with pride. I straightened in my saddle and adjusted the gilded helmet on my head. To me, whose ancestors were plebeians, Rome has entrusted its fate in these days of mortal danger. Not one of those patricians who boast of their ancestors' wax masks is worthy of commanding even a maniple of my army. These Scipios, Fabii, and Metelli are so puffed up with vanity, they'll burst like the frog in that Greek fable. I turned to look behind me. The baggage train moving in the center of our marching column had vanished from sight. The fog rolling in from Lake Trasimeno was thickening, and soon I could see nothing but the blurred figures of soldiers in our advance guard. Suddenly, a chaotic rumbling came from somewhere above us. A shower of stones and a cloud of spears fell upon my Romans. Ambush! Flashed through my mind, and at that same moment, something heavy struck my head. Swaying, I grabbed my horse's mane, but the animal, apparently wounded, wheezed and collapsed beneath me. Sliding off to avoid being crushed, I felt my head. The helmet was gone. My hair was matted with blood below my left ear, but the skull seemed intact. "Where are you, Flaminius?" came the familiar voice of Terentius, most faithful of my lictors. Soon they brought me to the lake. Cold water ran down my cheeks and neck, tickling my back and chest. I straightened up. "Where is my helmet?" I asked. But how could anyone find it in this fog? The enemy was pressing forward. The mist made it impossible to see how many there were. The crush and panic prevented us from forming battle lines. Caught by surprise, my Romans scattered left and right, but they met warriors from other maniples being driven by Carthaginian cavalry. The battle began. Several dozen legionnaires surrounded me. My black, wet hair framed a pale, exhausted face. "Form a circle! Form a circle!" I shouted, waving my sword. The legionnaires formed a semicircle, desperately fighting off the Gauls who had rushed down from above. Hannibal had positioned them on the hills overlooking the road, ordering them to attack the enemy from there. Roman shields hummed from the impacts. I could hear the labored breathing of the already weary Gauls. A horseman joined them. Seeing me, he leaped from his horse and plunged into the fray. The sun warmed the air, and the fog began to dissipate. The lake became clearly visible, along with small islands in its center. Romans were trying to swim there for safety. Above the water, heads, shoulders, and arms clutching now useless weapons appeared. Balearic slingers had organized a real hunt for the defenseless men. Lead bullets caught up with Romans in the water. Others sought refuge on inaccessible cliffs. Slipping and falling, cries rang out from everywhere. Warriors begged for mercy and died under the blows. From a high hill, Hannibal could see the entire road to the rounded hills that closed off the lake from the north. Judging by the cloud of dust, one could tell that Hannibal's cavalry was returning, the force that had been sent after the Romans, who broke out of the encirclement. Now riders were visible on both sides of a long column of prisoners. Hannibal adjusted the black eye patch covering his eye. He had lost it 5 days ago while crossing the marshes. Looking with one eye felt strange. He remembered the superstition that a one-eyed commander is invincible. But I was defeating Romans before, Hannibal thought. Weren't Ticinus and Tribia victories? But the consuls managed to escape there. Here the army perished along with its consul. Hannibal turned his head toward the lake. Why aren't they bringing me Flaminius? What does he look like? This idol of the Roman plebeians who conquered the Gauls of northern Italy 3 years ago. The man whose name graces the road connecting Rome with the Alps, down there, in the valley by the road. Soldiers are already digging a grave where the consul's body will be laid. Let all Italy know that I, Hannibal, respect brave and courageous warriors, even if they are my enemies. The sound of hoofbeats approached. Hannibal's guard Ducarion rode up to him, looking at the Gaul's confused face. It wasn't hard to guess that the order hadn't been carried out. We searched the entire battlefield and, Ducarion said. Perhaps you killed someone else, Hannibal said, boring into the Gaul with his eye. How could I not know him? He took me prisoner, and when I tried to spit at him, he ordered his lictors to beat me with rods. The Gaul turned away and removed a sack from his horse's croup. He turned it inside out and handed the commander a helmet. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. Hannibal turned the helmet over in his hands, examining it carefully. Yes, this is the consul's helmet, he thought. Silver. On the movable visor is depicted a monster with an open maw, meant to frighten away the spirits of death. The stone struck just below the crest and left a long scratch. He peered inside the helmet, barely visible traces of blood. The blow must have stunned Flaminius. The consul removed his helmet to stop the bleeding and lost it. Then he fought without protection. That's when Ducarion struck him down with his sword, and the consul's lictors took the body. They threw it in the water or buried it somewhere. What does it matter? The Roman army has perished, along with its consul. This won't be the last Roman consul, Ducarion, Hannibal said, rising. I promise you that the helmet of the next consul, whoever kills him, will belong to you. But this helmet will bury in place of Flaminius, with military honors. Hannibal began descending the hill. Ducarion, shrugging his shoulders, followed behind him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. But I wasn't dead. The memory of that day at Trasimeno comes back to me in fragments. Like pieces of a broken mirror, I remember the cold water of the lake, the desperate fighting in the fog, the weight of my helmet before it was torn from my head. What I remember most clearly is the moment when everything changed, when I realized that death had passed me by, choosing instead to take my identity, my name, my very existence as Consul Gaius Flaminius. The Gaul who struck me down, Ducarion, I would later learn his name, had been eager for revenge 3 months earlier. During my campaign against the Gallic tribes north of Rome, I had indeed taken him prisoner. He had been defiant then, spitting at my feet when brought before me. My lictors had given him the beating he deserved, but I had spared his life. Roman mercy, I thought it was. Now I understood it had been Roman foolishness. When his sword found my chest that day at Trasimeno, I fell among the reeds at the lake's edge. The world went dark, but not forever. How long I lay there unconscious, I cannot say. When awareness returned, the sounds of battle had faded to distant echoes. Bodies floated in the bloodied water around me. My armor was gone, stripped away by scavengers who took me for dead. I should have been dead. The wound was deep, piercing between my ribs, but somehow it had missed my heart and lungs. Perhaps the gods had other plans for me. Or perhaps it was simply chance, that cruel mistress who decides which men live and which die in war. As strength slowly returned to my limbs, I listened to the voices of Carthaginian soldiers searching for survivors. They spoke of the great victory, of how completely they had destroyed the Roman army. They spoke of their commander's satisfaction at finally eliminating one of Rome's most dangerous generals. Flaminius is dead, they said with certainty. Ducarion brought his helmet to Hannibal. In that moment, lying in the mud and reeds, I understood that Gaius Flaminius, consul of Rome, had indeed died at Lake Trasimeno, not from Ducarion's blade, though it had come close enough, but from something more complete. The death of identity, of position, of everything that had made me who I was. When darkness fell, I crawled from my hiding place among the dead. My legs shook like a newborn colt's. But they carried me away from that cursed lake. I had no destination in mind except distance from the battlefield, where my former life had ended. For 3 days I wandered the hills, avoiding the main roads where Carthaginian patrols might find me. I ate roots and berries, drank from streams, and slowly felt my strength returning. But with physical recovery came a bitter realization. I had nowhere to go. To return to Rome would mean revealing the truth of my survival, and with it, admitting the scale of the disaster at Trasimeno. The Senate would demand explanations I couldn't give. Why had I walked into such an obvious trap? How had I allowed an entire Roman army to be slaughtered? My political enemies, and there were many, would tear me apart more thoroughly than Hannibal ever could. Worse still, my death had already served a purpose. Even now, messengers would be riding toward Rome with news of my heroic end, fighting valiantly against overwhelming odds. My sacrifice would rally the people, give them a martyr to remember when the war's end seemed distant. To return from the dead would rob Rome of that inspiration. No, Gaius Flaminius was dead, and it was better for Rome that he remained so. But what was I to become? The answer came to me slowly as I made my way south, keeping to forest paths and abandoned trails. If Consul Flaminius was dead, then perhaps Marcus the freedman could live. I had once owned a slave by that name, a Greek scholar who had earned his freedom through years of faithful service. He had died of fever 2 winters past, but his identity might serve me well. I found refuge in a small town called Sutrium, where the innkeeper asked no questions of a wounded traveler willing to work for food and shelter. My hands, once soft from a life of privilege, grew calloused from carrying water and cleaning stables. My back, once straight with the pride of command, bent under the weight of menial tasks. The people of Sutrium knew nothing of my past. To them, I was simply Marcus, a middle-aged freedman who had lost everything in the war and sought honest work. They treated me with a casual indifference reserved for such men, neither cruel nor kind, simply accepting my presence as one accepts the weather. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, I would sit by the inn's hearth and listen to travelers' tales. News from the war filtered in slowly, often distorted by distance and repetition. I heard how the great Hannibal continued his march through Italy, how city after city opened their gates rather than face his army. I learned of the panic in Rome when news of Trasimeno arrived, of the Senate's desperate attempts to raise new legions, and always, they spoke of Consul Flaminius, how he had died fighting, how his body was never found, how Hannibal himself had ordered military honors for his fallen enemy. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. In some versions, I had slain a dozen Carthaginians before falling. In others, I had charged single-handedly into the enemy ranks, sword flashing like lightning. I listened to these tales with a mixture of bitter amusement and profound sadness. They were creating a legend from the fragments of my failure, turning catastrophe into heroic myth. The real Gaius Flaminius, Flaminius, proud, stubborn, blind to his own limitations, was fading away, replaced by a figure of bronze and marble that bore little resemblance to the man who had led 30,000 Romans to their deaths. Sometimes I caught glimpses of my reflection in the inn's polished bronze mirrors. The face looking back was changing, aging rapidly under the weight of loss and guilt. Gray streaked my hair, which I now kept shorter than fashion demanded. Lines deepened around my eyes that had seen too much, lost too much. Even my voice was different, the cultured tones of the educated class giving way to the rougher accent of common folk. I was becoming someone else, and perhaps that was what I deserved. Months passed in this strange new existence. Winter gave way to spring, and still I remained in Sutrium, finding purpose in purposelessness. The physical wounds from Trasimeno had healed, leaving only faint scars across my ribs. But the deeper injuries, to pride, to faith in myself, to everything I had believed about duty and honor, those festered like infected wounds. It was during this time that I began to understand what I had truly lost. Not just my position as consul, not just my army, but something more fundamental, my sense of who I was meant to be. All my life, I had defined myself by my role in Rome's great story. I was Gaius Flaminius, plebeian who rose to consul, builder of roads, conqueror of Gauls. My identity was inseparable from my public function. Now I was nothing, or perhaps, more precisely, I was free to become anything. The innkeeper, a shrewd woman named Claudia, began to trust me with greater responsibilities. She had me managing supplies, negotiating with traders, even keeping the accounts, tasks that required skills I had learned as a magistrate, but now applied to humbler purposes. I found unexpected satisfaction in this work when I balanced her ledgers perfectly, when I negotiated a favorable price for grain, when I resolved disputes between her serving girls. I felt a small but real sense of accomplishment. It was different from the satisfaction of commanding legions or delivering speeches in the Senate. Smaller, yes, but also cleaner somehow. No soldiers died because of my decisions at the inn. No families were left fatherless because I miscalculated the price of olive oil. One evening, as I was closing the shutters against a spring rainstorm, a messenger arrived. He was young, barely out of boyhood, and exhausted from hard riding. His cloak bore the insignia of an official courier, and when he spoke to Claudia, requesting a room for the night, his accent marked him as Roman. Against my better judgment, I lingered nearby, pretending to arrange amphora while listening to their conversation. Terrible business, this war, Claudia said, pouring wine for the boy. They say Hannibal grows stronger every day. The messenger nodded grimly. It's true. He's moved south from Trasimeno, taking cities all along the way. The Senate is in constant session, trying to find someone who can match him. What about Fabius? They made him dictator after. She paused, glancing at me. Even here, so far from the centers of power, people knew better than to speak carelessly of Rome's disasters. After Flaminius fell, the boy finished for her. Yes, Fabius Maximus is in command now, but his strategy. The messenger shook his head. He refuses to give battle, follows Hannibal's army at a distance, harassing his supply lines, avoiding direct confrontation. Some are calling him Cunctator, the delayer. I nearly dropped the amphora I was holding. Quintus Fabius Maximus, old, cautious Fabius, had been given supreme command, the same man who had opposed my aggressive policies in Gaul, who had warned against pursuing Hannibal too eagerly. If I had listened to his counsel before Trasimeno, but that path led only to madness. I forced myself to focus on the present moment, on the simple task of arranging wine jars in neat rows. Is it working? Claudia asked. This strategy of delay? It's preventing another disaster like Trasimeno. The messenger admitted, but the people grow impatient. They want action, decisive battles, glorious victories. Some say Fabius is a coward, that he's letting Hannibal ravage Italy, while Rome's armies cower in the hills. How familiar that sounded. I had spoken similar words myself, before I learned the price of such thinking. Now I understood why Fabius pursued this unglamorous strategy. He knew what I had been too proud to admit, that Rome could afford to lose many battles and still survive. But another Trasimeno might destroy the Republic itself. The messenger drained his cup and rose to retire. As he climbed the stairs to his room, he paused and looked back at Claudia. There's talk in Rome, he said quietly, of raising new consuls for next year, men who will abandon this policy of delay and bring the war to Hannibal directly. When he was gone, I continued my work in silence. But inside, my thoughts churned like water in a cauldron. For the first time since Trasimeno, I found myself thinking not as Marcus the freedman, but as the man I had once been, the man who understood strategy and politics, who had commanded armies and governed provinces. Fabius was right to be cautious, but caution alone would not win this war. Eventually, Rome would need to face Hannibal directly, but when, and where, and how were crucial. The wrong choice would mean another massacre, perhaps the final one, and there would be wrong choices. I knew the men likely to seek the consulship, knew their ambitions and their weaknesses. Varro, With his appeals to the mob and his promises of quick victory, Paulus, honorable but inflexible, prone to the same kind of thinking that had led me into Hannibal's trap. Others too, each carrying the same burden I had carried, the weight of Roman expectations, the pressure to achieve what no Roman had yet managed. They would make the same mistakes I had made, not because they were fools, but because the system itself rewarded the kind of thinking that led to disasters like Trasimeno. Quick victories brought fame and glory. Patient, defensive strategies were seen as cowardice or incompetence. I rose from my cot and walked to the small window that looked out over the town square. Dawn was still hours away, but I could not sleep. An idea was forming in my mind. Dangerous, perhaps impossible, but growing stronger with each moment. I contemplated it. What if there was another way to serve Rome, not as Gaius Flaminius, returning from the dead to reclaim his position and authority, but as someone else entirely? Someone who could offer counsel without ambition, who could speak truth without political consequences because he had no position to lose. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my supposed death might be not a curse, but a gift. Dead men could not seek office or accumulate wealth or build political alliances, but they could, perhaps, still serve their country in other ways. By the time the sun rose over Sutrium, I had made my decision. Marcus the freedman would continue to serve at Claudia's inn, but he would also begin to write letters to certain men in Rome who might benefit from the hard-earned wisdom of a consul who had learned the price of pride. Letters that would be signed not with my true name, but with a pseudonym, Critias, after the philosopher who wrote about the dangers of unchecked ambition. If I could prevent even one more Trasimeno, then perhaps my survival had been worthwhile after all. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. My first letter was the hardest to write. I spent days composing and recomposing it, trying to find the right tone, authoritative enough to be taken seriously, but not so distinctive that it might be recognized. The recipient was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a senator whose military experience I respected, even if I had often disagreed with his politics. To Lucius Aemilius Paulus, greetings from one who has learned wisdom through bitter experience. I began. You do not know me, but I know you, and I write to share insights that may prove valuable in these dark days of war. I wrote about the dangers of underestimating Hannibal, about the importance of choosing favorable ground for battle, about the need to coordinate properly with allied forces. Most importantly, I wrote about the trap of Roman pride, the Ensei, how our assumption of superiority could blind us to tactical realities. The greatest error a Roman commander can make, I wrote, is to believe that courage alone will overcome superior positioning and preparation. At Trasimeno, Consul Flaminius learned this lesson too late. Let not his sacrifice be wasted through repetition of his mistakes. It took me several attempts to write that passage without my hand trembling, even referring to myself in the third person, as if I were merely an observer analyzing another man's failure, brought back the shame and regret that haunted my nights. I sealed the letter with wax and gave it to the next merchant heading toward Rome, along with a few coins to ensure its delivery. Whether Paulus would read it, much less heed it, remained to be seen. The waiting was agony. For weeks I heard nothing, and I began to fear that my letter had been dismissed as the ravings of some ambitious nobody seeking attention. But then, gradually, news began to filter back through the network of travelers and merchants that connected small towns like Sutrium to the great world beyond. Paulus had indeed been elected consul for the coming year, paired with Gaius Terentius Varro, a man whose populist speeches and promises of quick victory I remembered all too well. More troubling still, I learned that the Senate had authorized the raising of the largest army in Roman history, 8 full legions. Along with an equal number of allied troops, they intended to crush Hannibal through sheer force of numbers. The news filled me with dread. I had seen what Hannibal could do to a well-positioned Roman army. What would he do to one so large it could barely maneuver? The tactical problems alone were staggering. Coordinating the movements of so many men, maintaining supply lines for such a massive force, finding ground suitable for deployment. I wrote more letters to Paulus and to others whose names I remembered from Senate debates and military councils. I wrote about the importance of unity of command, about the dangers of divided authority between co-consuls. I wrote about logistics and communications, about the need for reliable intelligence about enemy movements. Some of my warnings seemed to have effect. Through conversations with travelers, I learned that Paulus was indeed advocating caution, urging the Senate to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. But Varro's voice was louder, his promises more appealing to a populace grown weary of Fabius's defensive tactics. "The people want action," one merchant told me, repeating gossip from Rome's taverns and forums. "They say it's shameful for Rome to cower while a foreign invader pillages Italian soil. Varro promises to end this war with one decisive battle." I had spoken them myself, before I learned what decisive battles could cost. As spring turned to summer, the tension in my letters grew more urgent. I abandoned the philosophical tone of my early correspondence and wrote with the bluntness of a soldier addressing his comrades. "The army you are gathering is too large," I warned Paulus in one message. "Hannibal will not face such a force in open battle unless he has prepared some terrible surprise. Better to divide your forces, strike at his supply lines, force him to fight on ground of your choosing rather than his." But I could sense from the reports that reached Sutrium that my advice was falling on deaf ears. The momentum toward confrontation had grown too strong. Rome demanded vengeance for Trasimeno, and politicians like Varro were more than willing to promise it. In my darkest moments, I wondered if I should abandon this pretense and return to Rome openly. Surely my survival, my first-hand knowledge of Hannibal's tactics, would carry enough weight to change minds, but I knew better. The political machinery was already in motion. Careers and reputations staked on the coming campaign. My resurrection would be seen not as a gift but as an embarrassment. Proof that Rome's glorious martyr was just another failed general who had abandoned his post. No, Gaius Flaminius had to remain dead. Only Critias could speak truth without consequences. As the summer heat intensified, so did my sense of impending doom. Reports reached us that both consuls had taken the field, that their massive army was moving south toward Hannibal's last known position. The sheer size of the force, nearly 90,000 men, was causing logistical nightmares. Exactly as I had predicted, I wrote one final letter to Paulus, more desperate than any before it. "If you must give battle, choose your ground with infinite care. Do not let impatience or political pressure drive you to fight where Hannibal wants to fight. Remember Trasimeno. Remember how fog and difficult terrain turned Roman discipline into Roman chaos. Above all, maintain unity of command. One general making poor decisions is tragedy enough. Two generals disagreeing at the crucial moment is catastrophe." The letter left Sutrium with a grain merchant bound for Rome, but I feared it would arrive too late, if it arrived at all. That night, unable to sleep, I climbed to the roof of Claudia's inn and stared south toward the Apulian plains, where Rome's greatest army was marching toward its fate. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, two forces were converging, one driven by pride and political necessity, the other by the calculating genius of Carthage's greatest general. I had done what I could. The letters had been sent, the warnings delivered. Whether anyone would heed them remained to be seen. All I could do now was wait for news of what would surely be one of the most decisive battles in Roman history. I prayed to whatever gods might be listening that I was wrong, that my fears were simply the paranoid imaginings of a broken man. But deep in my heart, I knew better. I had seen Hannibal's work at Trasimeno. I knew what he was capable of when gifted with Roman overconfidence and tactical blindness. Another disaster was coming. The only question was how complete it would be. The news, when it came, was worse than even I had feared. The merchant who brought word to Sutrium was pale and shaking, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man who has witnessed something beyond comprehension. He had been in Rome when the first survivors began straggling into the city. and their tales had spread like wildfire through the streets and markets. "Can I?" he whispered, as if speaking the name too loudly might summon fresh disaster. "They're calling it Cannae." I helped him to a chair and poured wine with steady hands, though inside I felt as if the world was cracking apart. "Tell me," I said quietly. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by long silences and occasional sobs. The great Roman army, 90,000 men, the largest force ever assembled by the Republic, had been destroyed, not defeated, not scattered, but annihilated so completely that it would be remembered as the worst military disaster in Roman history. "They say Hannibal let himself be surrounded," the merchant continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Let the Romans think they had him trapped in the center of their line. Then his flanks closed in like the jaws of some terrible beast. The legions were so tightly packed, they couldn't use their weapons properly. It was slaughter. Consul Paulus was dead, killed fighting in the ranks like a common soldier when it became clear the battle was lost. Varro had survived, fleeing the field with what few cavalry remained. But his political career was finished. 80 senators had perished, along with countless other nobles and officers. The flower of Roman youth lay rotting on the plains of Apulia. But the most chilling detail was yet to come. "Hannibal's men are collecting the rings from the dead," the merchant said. "Golden rings from the fingers of knights and nobles. They say he's going to send them to Carthage as proof of his victory. 3 bushels of Roman gold, harvested from corpses." I closed my eyes and saw my own golden ring, the one that had marked my status as a consul. It lay at the bottom of Lake Trasimeno, lost when I had crawled wounded from the water. Perhaps it was better that way. At least my ring would not be part of Hannibal's grisly trophy. Over the following days, more details emerged as other survivors and witnesses reached Sutrium. The scale of the defeat was almost incomprehensible. Some estimates put Roman losses at 60,000 dead, including virtually the entire officer class. Hannibal had lost fewer than 6,000 men. More troubling still were reports of what had happened after the battle. City after city was defecting from Rome, welcoming Hannibal as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Capua, Rome's second most important ally, had opened its gates to the Carthaginians. Other towns throughout southern Italy were following suit. They say Hannibal could march on Rome itself. Claudia told me one evening as we tallied the day's receipts. Nothing stands between him and the city walls. I nodded grimly, though privately I doubted Hannibal would make that move. He was too clever to attempt a siege of Rome with the forces at his disposal. Better to let the political pressure build, to watch as Rome's allies abandoned her one by one. Eventually, the Senate would have no choice but to negotiate. But that night, alone in my room, I wept for the first time since Trasimeno, not just for the dead, though their number was staggering, but for the failure of everything I had tried to accomplish through my letters. All my warnings, all my careful analysis of Hannibal's methods, had been for nothing. The disaster I had feared had come to pass, magnified beyond my worst nightmares. Perhaps if I had been braver, if I had returned to Rome openly and revealed my identity. But no, that path led only to recrimination and useless speculation. I had made my choice at Trasimeno, and now I had to live with its consequences. What haunted me most was the knowledge that this catastrophe had been preventable, not inevitable, like an earthquake or plague, but the result of specific human decisions. Varro's impatience, the Senate's desire for quick resolution, the Roman conviction that superior numbers and courage could overcome any tactical disadvantage. All of these had conspired to create the conditions for annihilation. I had been part of that system once, had shared those convictions and made those same mistakes. At Trasimeno, I had walked into Hannibal's trap with the same overconfidence that had doomed Paulus and Varro at Cannae. The only difference was the scale of the resulting disaster. In the weeks following Cannae, I found myself unable to concentrate on my duties at the inn. I went through the motions of daily life, serving customers, managing supplies, maintaining accounts, but my thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by analysis of what had gone wrong and what might yet be done. Rome would survive this, I told myself. The city had endured defeats before, on the sack by the Gauls 3 centuries earlier. numerous setbacks during the conquest of Italy, but those defeats had been followed by resurgence, by the kind of stubborn determination that made Romans such formidable enemies. Yet Cannae was different. This wasn't just a military setback, but a fundamental challenge to Roman prestige and authority. When allies began defecting en masse, when the very foundations of the alliance system trembled, the political consequences could be more devastating than any battlefield loss. I began composing new letters, but found myself struggling with their tone and purpose. Before Cannae, I had written as someone offering advice to prevent disaster. Now I wrote as someone trying to help pick up the pieces after catastrophe had struck. The voice of Critias the philosopher seemed inadequate to the magnitude of Rome's crisis. My first post-Cannae letter was addressed to Marcus Junius Pera, who had been appointed dictator in the wake of the disaster. It was a difficult letter to write, not least because I had to resist the urge to say, "I told you so," regarding the warnings I had sent before the battle. The defeat at Cannae was not the result of cowardice or incompetence, I wrote, but of tactical and strategic errors that must be understood if they are not to be repeated. Chief among these was the decision to seek decisive battle on ground of the enemy's choosing, with forces too large to maneuver effectively. Based on survivors' accounts and my own understanding of Hannibal's methods, the double envelopment tactic he had used, letting the Roman center advance while his flanks closed in from both sides, was brilliant in its simplicity, but it only worked because the Roman commanders had played directly into his hands. Future commanders must resist the temptation to seek quick resolution through overwhelming force. I continued. Hannibal is too skilled to be defeated by mere numbers. He must be worn down gradually, his supply lines harassed, his allies turned against him. This is not the heroic warfare that appeals to Roman hearts, but it is the practical warfare that wins long campaigns. It was essentially the same advice I had been giving since my first letter to Paulus, but now it carried the weight of proven necessity. Rome could no longer afford the luxury of glorious defeats. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The years following, Cannae transformed Rome in ways I could never have imagined. The city that had once seemed invincible, master of Italy and conqueror of nations, suddenly found itself fighting for survival. But perhaps more remarkable than the military crisis was how Rome adapted to it, not through grand gestures or heroic charges, but through the kind of patient, grinding determination that I had never fully appreciated during my time in the consulship. My letters continued throughout this period, though their recipients and purposes evolved. Where once I had written to prevent disasters, now I wrote to encourage perseverance. Where once I had warned against overconfidence, now I had to guard against despair. Rome's strength has never lay in individual battles. I wrote to Marcellus, who had begun the slow work of reclaiming cities that had defected to Hannibal. It lies in the capacity to absorb defeats, learn from mistakes, and continue fighting long after other nations would have sought terms. Hannibal may have won every major engagement, but he cannot be everywhere at once. Patient pressure, applied consistently across multiple fronts, will eventually tell. It was strange to find myself advocating the very tactics I had once despised. During my consulship, I had chafed at Fabius Maximus's cautious approach, dismissing it as cowardly delay. Now, I understood its wisdom. Rome could not defeat Hannibal in direct confrontation. Trasimeno and Cannae had proven that beyond doubt, but it could outlast him. The war became a test of endurance rather than skill at arms. Hannibal's forces were formidable, but finite. Every casualty he suffered in Italy was irreplaceable, while Rome could continue raising new legions from its deep reserves of citizen soldiers. Every city he had to garrison was one fewer troops available for active operations. I watched this strategy unfold through the reports that reached Sutrium, and gradually began to see its effects. Hannibal was winning battles, but losing the war. His alliance with Philip of Macedon never materialized into effective support. His hopes of bringing Rome's Latin allies into wholesale rebellion proved overly optimistic. Most crucial of all, Carthage itself failed to provide the reinforcements and supplies he desperately needed. But the most significant development came from an unexpected quarter: Spain. The first reports were fragmentary, carried by merchants trading across the Mediterranean. A young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio had achieved remarkable success against Carthaginian forces on the Iberian Peninsula. What made these victories particularly noteworthy was not just their scale, but their nature. Unlike the grinding attrition warfare being waged in Italy, Scipio was actually outmaneuvering and outfighting Carthaginian generals on their own terms. They say he studied Hannibal's tactics, one traveling merchant told me, learned from our defeats and turned the lessons against our enemies. At Bacula, he used the same kind of flanking movement that Hannibal employed at Cannae, but in reverse. I listened to these accounts with growing fascination. Here was a Roman commander who had done what I had failed to do. Learn from Hannibal, without being destroyed by him. More than that, Scipio seemed to possess the kind of tactical flexibility that had been notably absent from Roman military thinking. I began writing letters to this young general, though I had no way of knowing if they would reach him across the dangerous waters between Italy and Spain. My messages focused on strategic rather than tactical advice. The importance of disrupting Carthaginian supply lines, the value of winning local allies, the need to coordinate operations with other Roman forces. Victory in Spain will mean more than any success in Italy, I wrote. Hannibal's strength ultimately depends on Carthaginian resources and reinforcements. Sever that connection, and he becomes merely another aging general, leading an isolated army in hostile territory. Whether my letters had any influence on Scipio's thinking, I could not say, but his subsequent actions suggested that he understood these broader strategic implications perfectly well. His conquest of New Carthage, Hannibal's main base in Spain, was a masterstroke that effectively ended Carthaginian dominance on the peninsula. More importantly, it freed Scipio to contemplate even bolder moves. As the war entered its 15th year, I found myself an old man. My hair had gone completely gray, my face was deeply lined, and my hands showed the calluses and scars of hard labor. The inn's patrons who knew me as Marcus the Freedman would have been astonished to learn that this bent-figure cleaning tables had once commanded Roman legions. But my mind remained sharp, and I continued following the war's progress with the intensity of someone whose personal stake in its outcome ran deeper than mere patriotism. Every Roman setback reminded me of my own failures. Every success offered a measure of redemption for the disaster at Trasimeno. The most intriguing development was the growing debate in Rome about whether to attempt an invasion of Africa itself. Scipio, now returned from Spain and elected consul, was advocating for a direct assault on Carthage's homeland, a strategy that would force Hannibal to abandon Italy and return to defend his own country. It was audacious to the point of recklessness, and yet, it might work. After years of defensive warfare, Rome needed a way to seize the initiative. More practically, an African campaign would finally remove Hannibal from Italian soil, allowing the peninsula to begin recovering from nearly 2 decades of devastation. I wrote my longest letter in years to Scipio, analyzing the strategic implications of his proposed campaign. The invasion of Africa represents our best hope of ending this war on favorable terms, but it must not become another Trasimeno or Cannae. The temptation will be great to seek immediate decisive battle. But remember that your primary objective is political rather than military. By threatening Carthage itself, you force them to recall Hannibal. Even if you do not capture their city, you will have achieved the strategic goal of clearing Italy. I went on to discuss logistics, the importance of securing local allies in Africa, the need for reliable naval support. Most crucially, I emphasized the danger of underestimating Carthaginian desperation. A cornered enemy fights more fiercely than one with room to retreat. If you succeed in bringing Hannibal back to Africa, you will face him not as the confident invader he was at Trasimeno and Cannae, but as a defender fighting for his homeland's survival. Such men are the most dangerous opponents of all. As I sealed that letter and prepared it for dispatch, I wondered if it might be my last contribution to Rome's war effort. I was growing old, and the physical demands of my life as a freedman were becoming harder to bear. But more than that, I sensed that the war was approaching its climax. One way or another, the long struggle between Rome and Carthage would soon reach its conclusion. Whether that conclusion would vindicate my years of exile and secret correspondence remained to be seen. But for the first time since Trasimeno, I allowed myself to hope that Rome might not just survive this war, but emerge from it stronger than ever. The news reached Sutrium on a crisp autumn morning that would forever divide my life into before and after. Scipio had done it, at a place called Zama, somewhere in the North African desert. He had finally achieved what no Roman commander had managed in nearly 17 years of war. He had defeated Hannibal in open battle. The messenger who brought word was a young cavalry officer, still dusty from hard riding across the Mediterranean routes. Unlike the broken men who had brought news of Trasimeno and Cannae, this one stood straight and proud, his eyes bright with victory. "It's over," he announced to the crowd that quickly gathered in the inn's common room. "The war is over. Hannibal has been defeated, and Carthage sues for peace." The details came out slowly, extracted through eager questioning and rounds of wine. Scipio's African strategy had worked exactly as planned. Faced with a Roman army threatening Carthage itself, the city's leaders had indeed recalled Hannibal from Italy, along with his brother Mago and what remained of their forces. The final confrontation had taken place near a town called Zama, where Scipio had deployed his legions with a kind of tactical sophistication that would have been unthinkable during my consulship, using Hannibal's own methods against him. The young Roman general had turned what should have been a Carthaginian victory into a devastating defeat. "Scipio let Hannibal's elephants charge through gaps in our lines," the messenger explained, gesturing with his hands to illustrate the formations. "Instead of breaking our ranks, the beasts ran harmlessly through to the rear. Then our cavalry, Numidian horsemen who had defected from Carthage, struck Hannibal's flanks while his infantry was still advancing. It was a masterful reversal of the tactics that had destroyed Roman armies at Trasimeno, Trebia, and Cannae. This time, it was Hannibal who found his forces surrounded and cut off from retreat. This time, it was Carthaginian blood that soaked the battlefield. As I listened to the account, I felt emotions I had not experienced in 20 years. Not just relief or satisfaction, but something approaching wonder. Rome had done more than survive Hannibal's onslaught. It had learned from its defeats, adapted its methods, and produced commanders capable of matching the greatest general of the age. But what struck me most deeply was the realization that Scipio had achieved this victory by embracing precisely the kind of thinking I had tried to promote in my letters. Tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine, strategic patience over impulsive aggression, the willingness to study enemy methods and turn them to Roman advantage. Had my correspondence played any role in this transformation, I would never know for certain, but I chose to believe that perhaps, in some small way, the lessons learned through my failure at Trasimeno had contributed to Scipio's success at Zama. The peace terms, when they were announced, proved almost as satisfying as the military victory. Carthage would pay enormous indemnities, surrender its fleet, abandon all territorial claims outside Africa, and promise never again to make war without Roman permission. Most symbolically important, Hannibal himself was to be handed over to Roman justice. That last provision troubled me more than I cared to admit. I had spent 17 years studying Hannibal's methods, analyzing his victories, trying to understand the mind that had inflicted such devastation on my homeland. In the process, I had developed a grudging respect for his genius, even as I remained committed to his destruction. The thought of seeing him paraded through Rome's streets, displayed as a trophy before being strangled in the Tullianum prison, left me feeling oddly melancholic. It would be justice, certainly, more mercy than he had shown to the Romans slaughtered at Cannae, but it would also mark the end of an era, the final closing of a chapter that had defined my entire adult life. As it turned out, I need not have worried. Within days of the peace announcement, word came that Hannibal had escaped Carthage rather than face Roman captivity. Some said he had fled to the east, seeking refuge with Rome's enemies in Syria or Asia Minor. Others claimed he had taken poison rather than endure the humiliation of surrender. Either way, the man who had haunted Roman nightmares for nearly 2 decades had vanished into legend, leaving behind only the memory of battles won and lost, of an empire that had trembled and somehow found the strength to endure. In the celebrations that followed the peace announcement, I found myself thinking not of triumph, but of endings. The war that had destroyed my old life and shaped my new one was finally over. The question now was what came next. I was no longer a young man, 62 years old, according to my careful count. with gray hair and hands gnarled from manual labor. My body ached in ways that reminded me daily of my mortality, yet my mind remained sharp, and the habits of analysis and correspondence that had sustained me through the war years were too deeply ingrained to abandon. Rome would face new challenges in the years ahead. Victory over Carthage had established the Republic as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, but dominance brought its own problems. How would Roman institutions adapt to governing an empire? How would traditional values survive the corrupting influence of vast wealth and unlimited power? These questions fascinated me in the same way that military strategy had during the war years. Perhaps there was still a role for Critias, the philosopher. Still wisdom to be shared through carefully crafted letters to men who held the Republic's future in their hands. But first, I needed to make a pilgrimage. 20 years had passed since the disaster at Lake Trasimeno. 20 years since I had crawled wounded from that fog-shrouded battlefield, leaving behind my identity and everything I had once believed about myself. The time had come to return to that place, to stand once more on the shore where Gaius Flaminius had died and Marcus the freedman had been born. I told Claudia that I needed to visit relatives in the north. Not entirely a lie, since I was in a sense returning to meet my former self. She granted me leave without question, trusting in my reliability as she had learned to do over the years. The journey to Trasimeno took 3 days, traveling by foot along roads I had once ridden as a conquering general. The landscape had recovered from the war's devastation, but I could still see scars where armies had passed, abandoned farmsteads, overgrown fields that had once fed Roman soldiers. When I finally reached the lake, I was struck by how peaceful it appeared. The water sparkled blue-green in the afternoon sun, fishermen's boats dotting its surface like water bugs. Children played along the shore where 20,000 Romans had died. Nature had reclaimed the battlefield, erasing all visible traces of that terrible morning's work. But I knew where to look. Following half-remembered paths, I made my way to the northern shore, where Hannibal's trap had been sprung. Here, among the reeds and rocks, I had made the transition from consul to exile, from public figure to private citizen. I knelt by the water's edge and let my fingers trail in the cool lake. Somewhere beneath these placid waters lay the bones of my former self. Not literally, perhaps, but spiritually. The proud, ambitious man who had ridden out from Rome to destroy Hannibal had perished here as surely as if Ducarion's blade had found his heart. What had emerged from those waters was something different, humbler, wiser, perhaps even better suited to the long struggle that had followed. Marcus the freedman had accomplished things that Consul Flaminius never could have managed, not through public glory or political power, but through patient service and quiet counsel. As I knelt by the lake that had witnessed my transformation, I noticed something glinting in the shallow water near the shore. At first I thought it might be a coin dropped by some passing traveler, but as I reached for it, my fingers closed around something far more significant. It was a piece of bronze, green with age and worn smooth by 20 years of lake water, but I recognized it immediately. A fragment of my consul's helmet, the gilded bronze that had once marked my authority and pride. The design was still faintly visible, part of the monster's jaw that was meant to frighten away the spirits of death. How ironically appropriate. The helmet that was supposed to protect me from death had instead delivered me to a different kind of transformation. I had not died at Trasimeno, but I had been reborn. I held the fragment up to the afternoon light, remembering the weight of the full helmet, the ceremony of putting it on before battle, the pride I had felt in wearing the symbols of Roman authority. That man seemed like a stranger to me now. Not evil, perhaps, but dangerously naive in his certainty that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. The real Gaius Flaminius had believed that Rome's destiny was inevitable, that Roman virtue would triumph over foreign cunning through sheer force of will. He had never imagined that an enemy might be more clever than brave, more patient than aggressive. He had thought that understanding warfare meant memorizing the old tactical manuals, not studying the mind of a revolutionary genius like Hannibal. That ignorance had cost 30,000 Roman lives at Trasimeno. It might have cost the Republic itself, if other men had not learned from his failure. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that failure, properly understood, could be more valuable than easy success. My letters to Scipio and other commanders had not been the musings of a philosopher, but the hard-won wisdom of a man who had paid for his education with the lives of his soldiers. Standing now in the peaceful afternoon light, I realized that my story was not one of defeat, but of redemption. Not the personal redemption that comes from public rehabilitation. I would never again be Consul Flaminius, never have my name carved on monuments or celebrated in histories, but the deeper redemption that comes from service to something larger than oneself. For 20 years, I had served Rome more faithfully as Marcus the freedman than I ever had as consul. My letters, written in anonymity and received without fanfare, had played their part in the Republic's ultimate victory. The wisdom purchased with disaster at Trasimeno had found its way, through careful channels, to the men who needed it most. I slipped the bronze fragment into my pouch and rose from the water's edge. The pilgrimage was complete, but my work was not finished. The defeat of Hannibal marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Rome now faced challenges that would require different kinds of wisdom. How to govern conquered peoples without losing Roman identity. How to manage vast wealth without corruption. How to maintain republican institutions in an imperial age. These questions would shape the next generation of Roman leaders. Men who had grown up during the war years and understood the price of failure. They would need guidance, not from politicians seeking advancement, but from those who had learned hard lessons about the limits of power and the importance of humility. Critias the philosopher still had letters to write. The journey back to Sutrium took me through countryside. I remembered from my consulship. Rolling hills where I had once drilled legions. Market towns where I had requisitioned supplies. Crossroads where I had received intelligence reports about enemy movements. But I saw it all now with different eyes, understanding how much I had missed during my years of authority and certainty. The real strength of Rome lay not in its legions or its generals, but in the countless ordinary people who went about their daily lives, regardless of who ruled or what wars raged in distant lands. Farmers who planted crops, even when armies might trample them. Merchants who maintained trade networks despite pirates and bandits. Craftsmen who perfected their skills without thought of glory or public recognition. I had spent my consulship focused on grand strategy and military glory, never truly seeing the foundation upon which all such achievements rested. Now, after 20 years of manual labor and anonymous service, I understood that true leadership meant supporting and protecting these quiet virtues, rather than seeking to transcend them. When I reached Sutrium, Claudia welcomed me back with genuine warmth. "How were your relatives?" she asked, and I smiled at the question. "Well," I replied truthfully, "we had much to discuss, but I think we understand each other better now." That evening, as I resumed my duties at the inn, I felt a contentment I had never known during my years of political prominence. This was honest work, useful work, work that made people's lives a little easier, without demanding recognition or reward. But after the guests had retired and the common room was quiet, I took out writing materials and began composing a new letter. This one was addressed to Scipio himself, now the hero of Rome and likely to play a major role in shaping the Republic's future. "The victory at Zama marks the end of Rome's greatest trial," I wrote, "but also the beginning of its greatest test. Military conquest is simpler than wise governance. It is easier to defeat enemies and to resist the corruption that comes with unlimited power." I went on to analyze the challenges that lay ahead. The integration of new territories, the management of client kings and tribute peoples, the need to maintain Roman character while adapting to imperial responsibilities. Most importantly, I emphasized the danger of believing that military success guaranteed political wisdom. Remember that Rome's strength has always come from its institutions and traditions, not from the genius of individual leaders. Preserve those foundations, and the Republic will endure long after its current heroes are forgotten. As I sealed the letter and prepared it for dispatch, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. 20 years ago, I had been one of Rome's most powerful men, commanding armies and shaping policy through public debate and political maneuvering. Now I was a freedman working in a country inn, known to no one beyond the walls of a small Italian town. Yet I had never felt more useful or more content. The letters I wrote as Critias carried more weight than any speech I had delivered in the Senate. The wisdom earned through failure and exile was more valuable than all the victories of my consulship. Gaius Flaminius had died at Lake Trasimeno, taking with him all the pride and ambition and certainty that had made him both great and dangerous. What survived was something simpler but perhaps more durable, a commitment to truth over glory, to service over recognition, to the kind of quiet virtue that sustains republics even when their most famous citizens fail. The bronze fragment from my helmet lay on the table beside my writing materials, a reminder of transformation and redemption. Tomorrow I would return it to the lake, completing the circle that had begun 20 years ago in fog and defeat. But tonight, there were more letters to write. Rome's greatest challenges still lay ahead, and somewhere in the city's corridors of power, men would need the hard-won wisdom that only failure could teach. The consul's helmet was lost, but its lessons lived on in the careful words of an anonymous philosopher who had learned that sometimes the most important victories are won by those who are never remembered for winning them. The war was over, but the work of building peace had only just begun.